Welcome to the Book People. I'm your host Aishwarya, a writer, a book editor, podcast producer, and the head of originals at Bound. In this path-breaking video podcast, I demystify the publishing and creative industries and uncover the biggest opportunities and challenges for writers in India today. Season 2 is starting with such a banger episode, and I'm very excited about it. Today, I'm talking to Unni Nambudripad, the head of originals at Spotify. So, the audio industry has been growing exponentially in India over the last few years, and it is supposed to grow by 5 times by 2030. Right now, India is the third largest market for podcasts around the world, and we are witnessing huge international companies like Spotify who are focusing right now on podcasts and on audiobooks. So Unni Nambudripad is right in the middle of all of this, right? He's leading the originals and content development at Spotify in India. And in the past, he has worked at Bloomberg TV, Hotstar, and Savan, right? So a combination of he's in journalism, OTT, and now podcasts. Today, he's here to talk about where the audio industry is headed, what Spotify's plan is for the next few years, and how can you, as writers and as content creative professionals, take advantage of this opportunity. So let's dive in. So, hi Unni, welcome to the Book People Season 2. With you have your separate section and charts for listeners. You're creating platforms like Anchor for creators to record the podcast on. And of course, you're creating your own original podcast as well. So I'm really looking forward to getting into really the mind of how Spotify works and how Spotify thinks. And I want to know, what is the opportunity that you are seeing in the world of audio content and in books as well?
Yeah, once again, thanks for having me on the podcast. Excited to be here. I think it's only my second podcast recording, which is ironic given that I've been in the podcasting space for almost 7 years now.
Yeah, I just assume that you must have done a ton of these recordings and you're now a pro at, coming for these interview podcasts.
No, I'm always behind the scenes, right? So I'm never in front of the camera or the mic. But it's good to be here. So let me, before I get into what I do at Spotify, let me talk about Spotify and its journey a little bit in the last 3.5, almost 4 years, right?
Sure.
I was employee number 1 in the podcast team, and now we're a much larger sort of team. So I helped set up the business. I handle all of the originals and most of the content that comes in. So that's across languages, right? So Hindi, English, Tamil, Telugu, Bengali. Soon we'll have new languages that come in as well. So the main goal is to get more people to listen to the content that we consume, right? As you know, the podcasting space is still new, it's nascent, it's grown a whole bunch since the pandemic, but we're still we're still at that cusp, right? At that tipping point. So my role is to get content commissioned and acquired that doesn't necessarily exist in the podcasting space, right? So for instance, we have a pretty popular podcast called Bhaskar Bose. It was one of the first podcast that we commissioned, produced by our fabulous partners at M&M Talkies, which is headed by Mantra. The concept of thriller podcast didn't exist that much in India. Since then, we've done a lot, but the idea was, okay, if this sort of content does work in the video space, can we find some sort of adjacency in audio, right? So we did a cricket podcast with Gaurav Kapoor. We did a sex and dating podcast, and we've done a whole bunch since then, right? So the idea is to not just get users onto the platform, but create interesting stories, and that people will get associate Spotify with, right? That's the end goal. When people see a trailer or hear a trailer, they should be like, okay, I want to go listen to this podcast. What is a podcast, right? Why should I go listen to it? So it's a lot of this sort of thing that my sort of thinking always goes into across languages. And when we go into the language, this year we've done Bengali, Tamil, Telugu. We've done a little bit of Malayalam. So how does that change, right? So can you take learnings from one market and take it to another market? A little bit, yes. But these markets are also so different, like we're the cliched thing, but we're a continent in itself, so different cultures and stuff. So how do you apply learnings, but then understand cultures of those specific languages, right? And cater to that. But ultimately, it's all user first, right? And that takes a shift in thinking. So I'm always on a daily basis thinking, okay, will this interest a user? So I need to step back a little bit and say, okay, if this content is coming in let's say Tamil, is this interesting for a Tamil user who is listening to music who may not have streamed a podcast?
Yeah.
Sort of a roundabout answer, but that's holistically what I sort of do at Spotify.
No, that makes perfect sense. And, it's very interesting, the experimental nature of your work. Because, when you were talking, I was also comparing it to how, say, publishing or books work, and what you're doing is obviously a lot of what editors do as well, where they're looking at readers first and they're thinking about, okay, would this be interesting to a reader? Whether in this particular language or, this genre of book, would that be exciting? But it's very interesting to see how, because podcasts are a new medium, there's just so much more scope for that kind of experimentation, which I feel with books at this point, there is a little bit of acquired knowledge in a sense already, where you're like, okay, we know that this genre works for these people and this is kind of the audience. Whereas I think there's a lot of that interplay of, okay, if this kind of a book works, would that work in an audio format? And if this kind of thing works on OTT, would that work in audio format? So that's some experimentation that I'm also seeing with my work, which I think is very exciting. So, what does a day in your life look like? What do you do on a day-to-day basis at Spotify?
Okay. So I can give you the short answer or the long answer. I think I'll go for the long answer because we have time, right? We're podcasting.
Yes.
So at Spotify, it's evolved for me. Right. So a lot of what we're trying to do from a content perspective is, and you mentioned experimenting, right? For me, that is at the heart of what we do till we reach that tipping point and where maybe what video streaming was in India maybe 6-7 years back, right? Will we get to that stage? I don't know, right? Where we are, we need to find our space in the whole media market. But that's something that always excites me, right? The experimentation part of it, and that's super important to what we do. Because we're building the market as we go along, right? So the number one thing, and you sort of took the words out of my mouth, is what can we do new, right? I'm always thinking of what are the different things that we can do. And since it's my role is a mix of creative plus business, I need to look at numbers. So one of the other things that I really look at and I've become passionate about is looking at data, right? And I always tell all of my colleagues that I work with that we need to be data informed, not data led, right? Which means, let's say it's 50% of it is what we're looking at from, okay, this genre is doing well, these podcasts are doing well, but that creative sort of instinct, right? That is super important for me. So I mentioned Bhaskar Bose earlier in the conversation. That podcast, it was really interesting how it sort of got commissioned, right? We had no data to back it up. I had heard this, like a trailer of this podcast when I was at my previous company. And when I joined Spotify, I said, okay, I want to hear it, right? And Mantra was really surprised. And he was like, why do you want to hear, like, it's dead. Why do you want to do this podcast? I said, no, I want to hear the podcast, the trailer again. He came to the office, we heard it together, and I was like, I want to do this show, right? There was no data, there was nothing. It was like, okay, so, and that's one of our most successful podcasts, right? So I think that one is data, so looking at directions in which we can go, but I also keep creative blocks in my calendar to make sure that I'm thinking of stuff. It's easier said than done. Because sometimes it's like, oh, you know what, a great idea is just going to come to me, but I've realized that's not how it works. You need to write down all of the ideas that are not so great so that you can get it out of your system. It's sort of that 10,000 hours thing, right? Where you're like constantly, you're looking to improve. So that's, I think, two chunks of my day, but also then working with the team to figure out, okay, across languages. And it's super interesting because Hindi is, we've done a lot more of. Tamil, we see a lot of growth in, but different from Hindi, obviously. So the approaches are very different. Telugu is a massive market, but there's not much talk happening. So how do we sort of spur content creation there? Bengali, there's a lot of content that's there, but the audience is much smaller. So different challenges, right? So it's important that I'm also getting an overview of what's happening and trying to figure out, okay, what are the stories we can tell? And we have this, so it's not just content that we're putting out, we're trying to figure out why are we different from, say, like, why is someone choosing to spend time with us? Now there might be two parts to it. One might be, okay, because they have the time. So let's say you're going to work in an Uber or in an auto and you're like, okay, I want to listen to something, I can't watch something. But we also want to get people to lean into our content, right? To say that, okay, this is something that I don't feel like watching this. I want to listen to something. I want to learn something, right?
Yeah. You want to get, all of us, I think, who are getting into podcasts want to get into a space where podcasts are not just convenient, but people are intentionally choosing to consume podcasts over, say, reading a book or watching something like on the screen, right?
I think that's where music and podcasts are slightly different, where it might be background listening in music, and obviously you're listening to Kesariya on loop, or you're listening to Rage Against the Machine on loop, right? But with podcasts, we have that opportunity to get people. I think this, for me at least, there's a lot of this knowledge and learning that comes in. I listen to podcasts because I want to learn something, right? How do I productivity, or how do I manage my time, or how do I be less anxious, right? So there's a huge opportunity there. The other thing that I didn't speak about is we don't have enough local content, right? So while Spotify has 4.2 million podcasts, the local podcast is still growing, right? So I don't necessarily mean only local language. So it could be this podcast as well, but relevant for listeners here in India, right? And that is extremely important, because while we may choose to consume something that is from, let's say, the US or the UK or Australia, we also want people telling stories from here, right? Like about books here, about movies here. All of that is really important.
We're seeing a lot of that need for sort of local or regional content, whether it's languages, whether it's the stories themselves, in all mediums and in books as well, with translations, because slowly sort of readers are very actively choosing to read translations. So that is definitely an interesting thing to tap into. But I want to also talk about a little bit about your background, because like you mentioned, so you have gotten a diploma in journalism. I checked. And then you've
Wow.
also and you've also worked across mediums, right? Because you've
Yeah.
sub-edited a magazine, you've worked in OTT, now you're working with audio. So what is the opportunity in storytelling that you are seeing right now in India, especially for writers or creators, storytellers who want to figure out what kind of story should they be telling and in what medium?
Now is the time to start creating, right? We see that across, like sometimes I look back and I was like, man, why did I do that diploma in journalism? I should have honed my skill as a creator. I would have been so much more popular and made so much more money. It's not that easy, granted, but I think the opportunity is huge. And the fact that in content in general, right, there is a lot of space to find your audiences, and I think that's the key. um, uh, uh, a lot of people go into it thinking, okay, you know what, I'm just going to copy what someone does, and I'm talking about in general before I get into podcasts, right? um, they see someone doing something and they're like, okay, I want to do that, rather than getting inspired and finding their voice, right? The other thing is, India is a unique market in the sense that we're so different, because we speak in like 2-3 languages. We understand, there's a lot of that's going on. So we may think in English, but we may consume in Hindi or Tamil, or different languages that happen, right? So it's important that we find our own voice, right? And that's when it comes to podcasting as well. We have this because we've seen the serials and Gimlets and all of these guys doing well. We immediately think, okay, that's what we should be doing in India, right? Whereas India is sort of a unique market and has its own way of dealing, right? So the way I sometimes equate it is with, let's say, UPI, right, or with Amazon Prime delivery, right? In India, you order something, now things have started, landing up at our doorstep in 30 minutes, right? But this is a problem or a solution that we took from somewhere and we made it our own, right? If your Amazon delivery doesn't come in a day, you're like, man, why is it taking so long, right? Whereas we used to wait such a long time. So I think that's important, right? Like taking what podcasts are globally, but making it ours. So while you will find stuff that you can do, like a true crime podcast, right? True crime is huge the world over. Whereas the way we might do it might be really different, right? Maybe crime we do, or maybe we fictionalize it. So the way we tell our stories need to be how each of those languages want those stories told, right? There is a lack of supply of content, right? So platforms, users are all looking for bullseye content, right? What is the content that I want to listen to, that I want to watch? So while there will be a whole bunch of content, and a lot of this, the way users consume is also changing, right? You would have, let's say, 10 years back, a Beyonce album would drop and it would be the biggest thing, right? I'm not saying, the queen is still the queen, but it's still sort of fragmented, right? Because there's so much music discovery happening. So while I might like Beyonce and might listen to her album, I'm not repeat listening for as much, right? I'm listening to other stuff as well. So the same thing comes when it's content creation, right? Writers can now not just write, you can create. And you spoke about Anchor. I can become a podcaster, right? If I wanted to, I can just record. It's become so easy now, especially thanks to the pandemic, where you can record, you can put up stuff. It's not just about only writing content. You can write for audio, but you can also create, right? So I think that is an opportunity that will come, and the kind of storytelling also changes with the medium. So while we think that, this is fine in video, it can work in audio as well, we've seen that that's not the case, right? So it also becomes interesting for people to, okay, I can't just write the way I'm writing for, let's say, television or for video streaming. But I need to change it around because people can't see. And this is something we see from, let's say, we did a podcast called Virus 2062 with Ali Fazal and Richa Chadda. And one of the things that Ali said was, he's a theater actor, right? So he was like, I couldn't use my face, right? Suddenly I had to only use my voice. And that was such a challenge, but it was so exciting, right? And Ali and Richa was so excited to do it. And that's what was so different for them, right? And that's why they want to do it. So if Bollywood stars can do it, it's the same across, right? How do you adapt yourself to that medium, and how do you then tell your story? And it doesn't have to be the same story. There's opportunity to tell multiple stories.
Yeah. So I think you've really hit on another question that I was going to ask you, which is, can coming from a very, like, say, book or written content to audio, can it be the same, or does it have to be changed a little bit? Because that's one of the questions that writers have for us a lot, because like we work with a lot of writers who essentially think of themselves as book writers, right? Or they're writing for books, so very like storytelling in a written format that you expect someone to read. And so the moment they have to sort of say write for podcasts or write for audio, that shift is also something that is so important and has to be learned. And it's something that we are also sort of exploring a lot with us, working with a lot of writers right now to create audio content for podcasts. And that journey in itself is also very interesting. So talking about sort of audio and books, I also saw that Spotify is now getting into audiobooks, right? I think it's going to do that in India as well. So what does that also mean for like the listeners and viewers of this podcast, who are themselves, who are readers, who are writers and listeners of books? What can they expect from Spotify's audiobooks?
So Spotify's audiobooks right now has rolled out in the US market. So that's something that we have put out access to 300,000 titles. Earlier this year we had acquired, last year we had acquired Findaway, which is a audiobook platform. So that's how we're sort of powering a lot of it. We're still working on new markets, including India. So that's a work in progress. So more updates on that later, hopefully. But it's important, right? It's important in the overall ecosystem. Audio is what we do. That's all we do, right? Unlike a lot of our competitors who are doing a whole bunch of things, this is where we want to sort of complete this ecosystem, right? So you don't have to go anywhere else. It sort of sits in between podcasts and music, in the sense that the way things are licensed, the commercial structures are all slightly different. With podcasting, it's completely free, right? So I'm a podcaster, I'm putting up a podcast, I can go onto Anchor, record it on my phone, it's up on Spotify in 3 minutes, right? And other platforms in a day or two. With music, it's sort of like a closed ecosystem where you sort of go through labels, their distribution companies, and then it comes onto Spotify. Audiobooks, it's in between, right? And that's something that Spotify is in the process of trying to figure out. And also because markets are different. So it's globally, it's a huge market. In India, it's a huge market. I believe it's also an untapped market in India with all of the languages that come in. So there's a massive opportunity, which sort of, you see dollar signs there, where if you can monetize it well, and if you can approach it well. But yeah, I think that will become a sort of a revenue stream across the whole life cycle, right? So from publishers, from authors, from platforms, because there will be, and going back to that last question, that's the opportunity in content as well, right? There's a huge opportunity that we see in the audiobook space. We are working towards figuring out how that'll translate into the Indian market because of the complexities. But yeah, it is a super exciting space, not just from a platform point of view, but if I were an author or a creator, in the years to come, it's going to be pretty big.
Yeah. From a listener perspective, what would you say really the difference between like a podcast or an audiobook is for someone who wants to sort of choose between the two? Because this is again a question that we get a lot, because ultimately they are both audio. So how would you distinguish that for listeners?
From a content standpoint, again, audiobooks have been approached in a certain way, and they've been approached from because there are incumbent sort of competitors who've set the market, right? The way we are looking at it is, and I'll be honest, right? Unless you're really interested in a book or in an author, audiobooks can get boring, right? In the sense that it's just, let's say I'm reading an audiobook, hopefully not, but let's say I am reading an audiobook and it's just one voice that sort of rolls on for a while, right? The way we want to approach it is how do we make it slightly more engaging, right? So when we come back to lean in content, it's not just, now if it's, I'll give you my example, right? If it's Ryan Holiday, who I'm a fan of, and he's talking about stoicism and he's reading the book, then it's interesting. If it's Stephen Fry reading Harry Potter, it's interesting. Shashi Tharoor, all those examples make sense. But otherwise, you need to figure out a way to keep people engaged, right? So what are the titles that are relevant to those audiences from a production standpoint and from a market standpoint, right? What are the different things that they want to listen to? Those are things that we'll start testing out. Like, does fiction work as much? Is it more non-fiction content? Is it learning content? Is it productivity? All of that, those are things that we're sort of figuring out. But I would divide them broadly in these two buckets of product and content.
Yeah. No, what you said about, say Stephen Fry voicing something is very interesting, because I also had this realization just yesterday. I was listening to an audiobook after a really long time. And as someone who's been working with podcasts a lot now because of my work, it was an old audiobook from like 2016, but still the experience was so completely different from what I think expected as an audio content consumer at this point. And it was pretty dull in that sense, where I feel like audiobooks are missing that next step of, how do you turn something into a storytelling experience beyond it simply being a book that's read out. So
and it doesn't have to be boring, right? Like, that's my whole point. If you have such the content is there, right? The material is there. It's the way it needs to be presented. And you said it slightly hesitantly. You said dull, but it is dull, right? Like when you have such interesting stories and you don't necessarily have the time to read through it, audiobooks are actually a great way of consuming that content. And you can change speeds. You can go at 1.5, which you can do with podcasts as well. But if only it was approached in a slightly different way, it can be a lot more immersive. And that's my biggest pet peeve with audiobooks currently, is that it needs to be, especially for Indian sensibilities, right? Like when we're bringing it here, and I'm not just talking about local languages, but even maybe for English, like how we approach it is super important. Because otherwise what happens is, let's say a couple of new users come onto it and say, hey, I want to listen to Do Epic Shit by Ankur Warikoo, right? And if it's not Ankur that's voicing it, and it's like just this random voiceover that's sort of reading it out, you've lost them forever, right? You're trying to create lifetime value. You could have that person coming in every month and listening to it. But if you don't present it properly, and as it is, you have the psychological layer that, oh my God, this is 9 hours. I need to listen to this. So those are, I absolutely agree with you in the approach that it's had. And that I think needs some changing.
Yeah, and I find it very interesting because, a lot of readers, like very loyal book readers, are still very hesitant to try audio or, listen to books in the audio format. Because I think that is one of the big gaps where, as a reader, when I'm reading a book, I'm sort of reading it out loud in my mind, in my voice. So, in a sense, there is tone, there is personality, there is humor, which I feel like when I'm just listening to it in the audiobook format is often lost quite a bit.
Yeah.
So it's very interesting to see how maybe also there is that potential for audiobooks to evolve into something more engaging. There's also this criticism at large against audio content that, it can be more like superficial, or it focuses more on entertainment rather than making you think, which I guess like books do more, or, books provide deeper engagement. Sort of one of the criticisms that I have heard of a book, written versus audio content. So what do you think about that? And how do you respond to that?
Hopefully I'm not responding on part of the audio industry. So let me just respond on behalf of myself.
Yeah.
I think it needs to be made interesting, right? And if if it's anecdotal, I would take it with a pinch of salt. If it's data led, then I would look at it seriously, because that is something that I believe we need to do, right? And it depends on what sort of content. So there are a bunch of layers to it, right? Sometimes what happens, and we see this on the platform as well, when users come onto the platform, they don't find what they're looking for, right? So and it's a factor of many sort of things, right? It's an evolving medium. There's supply of content, all of that. But what happens is, let's say they come onto this podcast and they listen to it, and they're like, okay, who's this guy talking about something superficially? I'm not interested in hearing it. Again, you've lost the person, right? So I think it's important to have enough content pieces that also hit different cultural interest groups, right? So I don't necessarily agree that that there isn't the scope to deep dive, because I think podcasts allow you to do that. It depends on what sort of content you enjoy, right? So let's say revisionist history with Malcolm Gladwell, or the Daily Stoic that I listen to. Those are all things that actually go pretty deep. Now, lack of local content is a challenge, and that's something that we as a platform are working on. And I know there's a lot of work that's being done in the audio space. But I think that's something that that is a factor of many things, right? So I wouldn't necessarily put a blanket statement to say that, yeah, books have been around for, I mean, there's a it's not a fair comparison, right? So people are also used to it a lot more. It's also a little bit of habit building. Okay, when I find the right podcast, is that sort of a gateway into finding other like-minded podcasts that I would like, right? So I wouldn't necessarily completely agree, but I think there is work to be done on the content side of it to figure out, okay, if users do feel that way, what can we do to go a little bit beyond just scratching the surface, because that's something we can do, right? Video or radio, or there are a lot of limitations that come with it. You and I can talk for an hour, and hopefully people will still be listening, but all of those things we have the liberty to do right now because we're in that experimenting phase. So yeah, it's on all of these content providers to also say that, okay, how do I reach out? How do I deep dive a little bit more, depending on what the subject is?
No, you're absolutely correct, because what you said about there being different kinds of content in each format, like there must be like there is a lot of what people would call fluff or superficial content in books, as much as there is really sort of deep, like research based stories and sort of research based books, and the same goes in podcasts as well, right? I think it's just one of the criticisms that does kind of emerge from what people are maybe seeing more of, like what is more, say,
Yeah.
popularly available, or what they can see people consuming. But if you are looking for, I mean, if you make the effort to look for exactly the kind of content that you want to consume, is available. I think there is a little bit of that as well with podcasts, where those systems of how people search for something, right? Like with books, they're at
Yeah.
this point a little bit more established. In India, where, okay, if I'm looking for a book in a specific category that does this specific thing or talks about this specific community or subject, I kind of know where to go looking for it or to look for recommendations. But I think with podcasts, even that is newly emerging, where it is still difficult to find what people want to consume. And like you said, there is a gap of sort of local content that's still being created, which definitely you and I can work on, create more content.
Can,
That
can
will,
I
yes.
can I respond to that? I think the way we look at again as a platform and in general content, right? Um, and that's why I'm saying that bullseye content or culturally relevant content is important, because we're trying to hit certain groups, right? Content
Yeah.
in general is subjective, right? So, or books, right? It's like, and what you and I may call fluff, there might be a readership for, right? And the same with content. I'll give you an example. My in-laws were watching this movie called Bubbly Bouncer, okay, with Tamanna, I think, and they were loving it, right? They were laughing at the jokes, and I was just like, "What's going on? Like, what are you finding funny?" Right? Because I didn't find it funny, but there is an
Right.
audience for that, right? But there should be content for me if I want to watch The Office and I can't find that content, then the platform needs to make sure that I discover the content, right? So I think in general, we need to figure out uh, which content is being made for which audience. And if people can't find the content, then platforms like us need to figure out how we can get to the user, right? Because um, user journeys are such where I might come onto the platform and I might, let's say, Aishwarya, you recommend a podcast to me, and I'm like, okay, I should listen to this podcast.
Yeah.
Um, and maybe I like it, right? But then after that, I finish that and I'm like, okay, I can't reach out to you, so let me figure out what podcast I can listen to, and then I don't find it and I drop off, right? And all I see is, let's say podcasts that I don't like, that are maybe, let's say, Bollywood podcasts or stuff that I don't listen to, right? And then so that's an issue, right? So I think it's important as a platform such as Spotify as well, that we are catering to all interest groups. So if you're a book nerd, you should be able to come onto Spotify and you should be able to find at least 10 to 20 podcasts. If you love Collywood, you should be able to come and listen to a podcast, right? So I think that's important when it comes to content, in the
Yeah.
sense that we need to program for all different kinds of audiences, which is easier said than done, especially when you're commissioning and creating content. But I think eventually that's where you want to be as a platform. You want everyone to be on the platform and say, oh, you're listening to this sort of content. I hate that, but I'm listening to this, right? And I can find it. So we want everyone to be on the platform and sort of find whatever suits their palette.
No, absolutely. And I think that, in addition to that, that word of mouth or sort of recommendations which kind of happens over time with everyone just kind of, recommending podcasts to each other, which happens
Yeah.
a lot with books now, right? Like there are influencers, there are people who solely sort of focus so much of the time on it and energy on simply reading and reviewing
Yeah.
or reading and recommending. Like that kind of a culture, I think also needs to and hopefully will slowly evolve around podcasts, which is just discussions, right? And sort of listeners just engaging beyond simply listening to a podcast to what they liked, what they disliked, what worked, what didn't work. And I think that in itself will also slowly get them more actively involved in podcasts, because right now,
Yeah.
for me as well, right, if I really love a podcast and I go and I recommend it to all of my friends, which I absolutely do, and like,
Yeah.
annoy them into listening, there are two steps there, right? One is just getting them to choose to listen to a podcast, and then the second is, okay, you listen to the podcast and then you listen to this specific podcast. So I think once that first step has been
Correct.
overcome, then the second step kind of becomes easier, where everyone is already consuming that and it's a part of their habit.
It's also habit building, right? Like you said,
Yeah.
it's so one is supply of content, which I'm coming back to, which is okay, you may recommend 3 podcasts to me, I may like one of them, uh, but then you may say, okay, you didn't like these 2, here's 5 more, but right now those 5 don't exist, right?
Yes.
So I think it's important that there are enough choices to folks, and right now that's how podcasts at least that's how I figure out the podcast that I like, right? I'm like, I have friends who are like, hey, have you heard this podcast? I'm like, no, okay, I need to check it out.
Yeah.
But I think as recommendations improve, as metadata improve, as we learn more from what users want, it might be easier to sort of surface the right kind of podcast to those particular people.
Absolutely. Okay, so I have the most important question for you. Are you a book reader?
Yes, absolutely.
And
I
what
mean,
are
I
you?
try. I'll be honest. I try. I have audiobook subscriptions. I have books, physical books. I have my Kindle. I have my Kindle on my phone. So I'm trying to multitask. But yeah, I try my best. I'm trying to create a routine and sort of figure out if I can do 15 to 20 pages a day. Still a work in progress. But yeah, I do try and read as much as I can.
That's so interesting. I've never heard of anyone divide books like that, like by pages. I mean, I've heard of people do chapters. I'm sure people do pages, but it's just very interesting.
So I'll tell you where I come from, right? If I don't make it, at least with me, if I don't make it a habit, then it sort of falls by the wayside, right? So some of the things right now, I'm veering off topic, but I've been meditating for 6 years now, and I do it first thing in the morning. But today I didn't do it, right? So then I'm like, okay, oh shit, I've missed it out today. Let me do it in the evening. I work out every day in the morning. I journal in the evening, right? So I've tried to make it this thing that I do. With
Yeah.
books, I haven't found that right. Like you see a lot of productivity hacks, and they're like, wake up in the morning and listen and read your. I just can't, right? I'm just trying to wake up in the morning, but that way at least it becomes a habit. And it's in my routine, right? As opposed to me just thinking about it and looking at my books every day or looking at my Kindle, and I'm like, oh no, I need to get to you, right? If I look at it as 15, 20 pages, and I read mostly nonfiction, so it's not like I'm reading fiction and then I go back and I'm like, shit, what just happened? I need to sort of go back 5 pages.
Yeah, or
Uh,
you're stuck at a cliffhanger and you're kind of like, okay,
yeah,
no,
yeah,
discipline. I will close this book and come back to it
yeah,
tomorrow.
yeah. So yeah, I'm a nonfiction guy.
Okay. What are you currently reading?
So I think I mentioned I'm into stoicism now. So I've been following Ryan Holiday, who's, I don't know, written like 13 books in 11 years. His latest book is out called Discipline is Destiny. And I've become a huge fan of the way he talks about stoicism and stoicism in general. So I read his last book. I mean, I don't think it was the last book, but I read Ego is the Enemy, Courage is Calling, and I've just ordered Discipline is Destiny. So I'm going to read that. Like I said, all my fiction stuff is on video, all my non-fiction stuff is on books and podcasts. So I'm a huge fanboy of Adam Grant. So all of his books, originals, Think Again, Givers and Takers. Um, then there's Malcolm Gladwell. So all of his books, Tipping Point, Bomber Mafia, all of that. I think on top of that list will be Michael Lewis, who's written Moneyball, The Big Short, Flash Boys. I love the way he sort of approaches his writing. So for me, it's all nonfiction because I want to know about stuff. I used to work in news. I still follow the news religiously, not on TV channels, but in general, otherwise. So I'm looking to upskill, right, in terms of what I know and how can I get better at life. All of those sort of cliched things, but that's pretty. All of my reading. I did try a little bit of nonfiction, sorry, a little bit of fiction, but I just couldn't, right? Because I would stop and then I needed to go back and I was like, wait, where's the story?
Yeah,
So I really struggled with that. Yeah.
okay, that's fair. Actually, see, I mean, with books, there is a lot more readership for nonfiction than there is
Yeah.
for fiction
Yeah. Yeah.
as a whole. And even publishers are that's why looking for a lot more nonfiction, which is very interesting because it's a gap that we have seen where most of the writers in India are writing fiction, especially writers who are getting into writing now during the
Interesting.
pandemic, which a lot of people have done, are
Yeah.
mostly writing fiction. So there is this sort of gap that's occurring within the publishing industry, which is very interesting in terms of audio as well, right? And the opportunity for writers in audio. So, what kind of audio content are Indians listening to right now?
All of our lives changed with COVID and the pandemic.
Yeah.
In podcasting, the trends also sort of started changing, right? So initially we saw like a lull in listening and then suddenly just shot up, right? Because I think people were still getting used to the idea of working from home. Where does audio fit into my life? It took me a while to get that, right? Mine was getting into the cab, coming to work. Then all of a sudden I wasn't doing that, right? So it was tough to sort of fit a time to my listening. We saw a lot of meditation, devotional, sleep, and ASMR really going up the charts, right? So, um, like storytelling, uh, like what Calm has, similar to that, where Harry Styles is reading out a bedtime story to you. Obviously, not that. I mean, that would be great too. But we saw a lot of the sleep sort of content that was coming up, right? So it could be just people talking. There was a lot of sleep ASMR, which was really different for us to see. A lot of the content we saw was also self-help, and we've seen that, right? That was pre-pandemic as well. We've seen that with a lot of the content we commission, a lot of the content that's on the platform that's user generated, that's from third party. Self-help was a big sort of theme there. Motivational content was huge, and now we've started seeing a lot of knowledge and learning content as well. So educational content, it could be in the learn English space, it could be like finance, it could be productivity. A lot of those content pieces have come up. We've also seen fiction do really well on the platform. A factor of us also doing a lot of it. Not many people were doing it before. Now a lot more people are doing it. But yeah, within fiction, we saw thriller. We've seen romance do well as well. So yeah, broadly, those are sort of our audience on Spotify is also skews younger. So that's why you see a lot of this ASMR and stuff do well. But we have audiences obviously all across the age bracket.
That's exactly why I said that the fact that there is a lot of potential in audio fiction is very interesting for all of the writers that are sort of now getting into writing and who are also writing a lot of fiction, right, and are figuring out how to get published. So, for these writers who say already have written something, what advice would you give them in terms of how do they start thinking about something that they have already written or an idea that they have as a podcast or as something that's good for audio?
I think in many senses is actually similar to, let's say, writing a book, right? Because you are not writing to visuals. One of the first rules I was taught in television was what are the visuals, and then you write to it, right? and that's how you would write your voiceovers. So I think it's very similar in that case, in that sense, sorry, but it's also different in the sense that it's a lot more compact, right? So in the books, you have the opportunity or the space to write slightly longer and you can explain things a little bit more. Here, you do have the luxury of, you don't have the luxury of time, right? So you need to make sure, because there are pretty quick drop-offs. People, if they're within 10 seconds, if they don't like it, they're off, right? So you need to keep people hooked to it. So I think YouTube is a great example of that, although it's video. The YouTube adage is always like, okay, within the first 30 seconds, you need to grab the listener, right? That's super important for audio. If you're writing for fiction, how do you create these cliffhangers so that same thing, right? Like, and again, it's similar to books, right? So you end the chapter, you're like, okay, I can't finish with 15, 20 pages today. I need to go on, right? It's the same that we've seen where you ended on a cliffhanger, and that comes with writing, right? So I think that's super important. I think the third part to it is listening to more audio content. A lot of the sort of pitches that we get are either based in something that works in the West, right? So how does it work in India? And some of these examples are there in audio, but some are also, you get a lot of these lessons from video, right? In terms of how it's written. Now in audio, there are different ways in which you can sort of put it out. So for instance, you won't necessarily see a person coming in, right? So you will need the person to say it out, saying, "Are Aishwarya, what are you doing here?" Right? As opposed to in a video, you come in and the camera just sort of pans to you. So those sort of things, I think, come with experience, and it's not. I think it would be sort of second nature for authors who've written like text, right? They know what it is. But the way it wouldn't be as verbose. It would be slightly. So in terms of writing, it's almost in between a book and video, because you're still trying to tell the story as quickly as possible, for the lack of a better phrase. But you don't have the sort of expressions, you don't have the cameras, right? So going back to what Ali Fazal said, right? He didn't have the face to say it, so he had to sort of use his voice modulation, right? That's how writing for audio is. You can use cues, but it depends on sort of the audience, right? And how they sort of react to it. If it's multiple voices and there's a knock on the door and there are different voices, you don't know. So also not adding as many characters, that's important. And these are just some of the lessons that we've learned, right? So let's say it's Aishwarya and Unni, and that's the podcast, right? The two of us are talking, and that's sort of the podcast. That's super important as well. So there are a bunch of these small sort of intricacies that are important, but I don't think it's very dissimilar to books. I think it sits somewhere in between video and writing for
So
text.
absolutely. I think one difference that I have seen a lot is that books, there's a lot of space, like you said, to have longer stories. There's also a lot of space to do introspection. There's a lot of like introspection, thinking, stream of consciousness, and that there is not space for an audio, in the sense of it has to go on. You can't sort of delve into the mind of a character and stay in the moment as much. And I think dialogue, like being able to write good dialogue, just becomes so important for audio, because so much of it is, in a sense, especially with fiction, dialogue between characters. Or even if it is, say, a single narrative thing, then that also almost is a little bit like a monologue, right? Like the way that it ultimately gets recorded and put out. So thinking of it like that, I think, really helps writers. I have seen make that differentiation between a book and writing for audio. And I've also seen a lot of writers now getting into, voice acting, right? Because like if they write something and then if they can host it, or if they want to figure out if they are the best voice to record it, because they're also able to capture that voice really well. Like right now, we're working on a podcast where the tone overall is very funny, but very satirical, right? So it's like the writer knows how to capture that really well, because that's his voice. So then it also makes sense to sort of explore whether he can also then do the voice for it, right? Because he knows best how to kind of capture that really well. So that is also an interesting thing to look into. So I have also seen, I mean, I don't know if you have come across this, but every now and then this happens, honestly, in the publishing industry every year or every 2 years, where there is this discussion about are books dying, and is video and audio content taking over, and this is the death of the novel, and this is death of this, death of that. So what do you see happening in the future in terms of all of these, I guess, formats, just storytelling in general in India?
I mean, we've had, is print dying or is television, like all of these conversations happen. I think it's a little bit more, it's not as simplistic as that, right? It's a little bit more complicated. Yes, in terms of traditional media, they are taking somewhat of a hit. But I don't think they're going to like just go away that quickly, right? Because it's also built over years and years of like books have been there probably the longest of all of us, right? So it's not just going to just change overnight. But I think what's important is how you sort of adapt to changing listener habits, technology. All of that is super important, right? Because Spotify as a company was sort of founded on that, right? Like the music industry was sort of going through this really weird phase, and our CEO Daniel Ek sort of said, okay, we need to change the way we're sort of looking at this, and that's where this whole new system came about, right? I think it's more evolution, and that's important. I don't think print is going to die, and all of those things are not going to happen so quickly, because a lot of, like you said, a lot of these deeper conversations, a lot of storytelling, a lot of this is still happening. I mean, with respect to books, right? It's still happening there first, right? And then coming on, right? Even if you look at just look at video, everything is based on a book, right? Everything is, and I'm not talking about books
getting adapted to the screen, right? Because even again with video, they're just looking for content, and they're like, we don't have enough content, let's go to the book.
Yeah, so what that tells me is that there's not enough quality content coming in, let's say, for video, and so you need to go to books. So, and these are not books, maybe some of them are slightly older ones, but they're all either adapted or based on, or like, I mean, I mentioned Michael Lewis, right? Like some 3 or 4 of his books have become movies, right? So, and these are like in the last 10 years. So I don't think that's going to change anytime soon, because then we wouldn't have seen so much of this. So I think a lot of the source content will still be in that book space. So it's not as simplistic as, oh, you know what, let's say radio is dead, or I think evolution needs to happen. So you need to find new streams of revenue, and I think authors have figured that out, right? Like, oh, I can before it was just book sales, now they're like, oh, I can sell it to Netflix or Amazon Prime or Spotify, right? So I think I don't think no one's going anywhere that quickly, let's be very honest. And I would say especially books, because a lot of the quality of content comes in from there, right? People are working on, like, let's say web series for maybe a year and a half, 2 years to write stuff. Books are, there are books being written for 5 years, 7 years, right? So it's not just and that will always be there. There's always going to be a dearth of quality in all sort of industries. I'm not just talking about content, right? And especially true with content. So I don't think books are going anywhere. It's just that the sources of revenue and the way monetization happens will probably evolve. So you may not sell as many copies, but you're making a whole bunch of money because they're acquiring your books. And not just that, because they're coming to you and say, hey, you've written a book like this, we want something similar, right? And you see a lot of the authors doing that anyway. So yeah, no one's going anywhere so quickly.
Yeah. And I'm also seeing a lot of writers sort of realize the potential that there now is for writers to also become themselves multi-format, right? Like, so to not sort of pigeonhole themselves as, oh, I'm a writer, I write books, but also look at, okay, where is potential for them to write different kinds of stories. Like, I'm currently working with a writer to launch a new podcast where we sort of came in contact with her because she was writing a book, and she has like published a couple of books. She's currently writing a web series, for
Yeah.
an OTT platform, and she's doing a podcast. So I think even that, for writers to kind of think of themselves as um, more sort of versatile storytellers rather than just sort of specific book writer, I think
Yeah.
that will open up a lot of opportunities for them, and they'll be able to get away from this idea of scarcity, right? That
Yeah.
something is unattainable and it's scarce and this is not gonna happen, or that there are fewer opportunities than before. Because I think actually now there are a lot more opportunities for writers and storytellers than there were before, maybe like a few years ago. So I think that's an
And,
interesting thing to look at.
and it comes back to your, I think, earlier question on opportunity in content, right? From a
Mhm.
creator standpoint, like you said, it's multifaceted now, right? You can, and what will probably happen is, let's say, Michael Lewis will be an author first, but then he will also be executive producer on movies and sort of work on that sort of thing, right? So I think that evolution happens where they're, like you said, they're multi-format. The base of what they do will, or the foundation will still be their original sort of work, right? And then over and above, they figure out other ways to do stuff, and it opens up. So I think that's a huge opportunity in content from a creator standpoint as well, because there's technology and everything sort of changing so quickly.
Yeah, absolutely. And because you mentioned Spotify, so say if someone wants to write something or create something for Spotify, how, or Audible or any other platform, how do they go about doing that?
So there are multiple ways, right? Spotify, and I think at the top of the conversation you mentioned Anchor, which helps creators create. First time creators might be middle tier creators who want to create. Anchor is a great opportunity for that. And I think you mentioned in a couple of minutes back about an author who was voicing it himself, right? So you don't have to be what audio lets you do is you can sort of experiment, and you can be in front of the mic as well. In terms of how we it's sort of divided into user generated and what we acquire and commission. We haven't gotten to the stage where we're saying, okay, you have a script, we want to acquire the script and we produce it. So usually when we get those sort of inputs, we say, okay, we're interested, we have production partners that we work with, why don't you work with them, and you can come pitch together, right? So that's from the owned and operated sort of commissioning models. But there's nothing stopping people from creating. There's this popular misconception that that you need like a production house. So maybe you do, but you don't need that, right? So if someone's listening and says, hey, I have these 10 episode podcasts, or I want to do an interview podcast on, let's say, the audiobook industry or podcast industry, there's nothing stopping you from starting that right now. And even if it comes to fiction, right? With fiction, it's a slightly, there's a few more steps involved, because it's not as simple as a interview podcast, right? So you write something and then there's a production house, or you may not be able to produce it, so you go to a production house. We're not at the stage yet where we, like I said, where we acquire these scripts and we sort of say that, okay, now we give it to production house. Hey, we just put those together and say, hey, why don't you work with these folks? There are preferred partners, they can sort of produce it for us.
You hit the mark when you said that a lot of people think that getting into podcasts always has to be this very high production value, high effort, high investment activity.
Yeah.
But that's not really true. I mean, for some podcasts, yes, you do need that, and fiction podcasts do need a little bit more than non-fiction might. But like one of the basic question we always get in terms of podcasts is, what kind of tech do I need? Do I need to buy extremely expensive recording equipment? Do I need a microphone? Do I need all of these things? So I think that again is an important sort of gap to that's an important thing for us to be also able to tell potential podcasters, which is essentially that, I mean, you can start off with, and we did that, like our very first podcast, which was Books and Beyond with Bound, literally started, I mean, we recorded the first season in a recording studio, but then obviously once the pandemic hit, there is just so much potential with these recording softwares. We have also recorded at least one season of the podcast simply using earphones, and like a free recording software. So there is a lot of ways to experiment and figure out a way to create podcasts that is also not necessarily extremely like financially problematic, but is something that can be done as an experiment. Again, I think it's just about wanting to experiment and thinking of everything at this point as a very experimental approach to figuring things out.
Yeah, and also I think it's also just sometimes a mindset shift where, like you said, you don't know the medium, and so let's say you're an author and you want to start a podcast, and you're like, yeah, my skill set is in writing, but I would also add you're a creator, right? So you can have conversations with people. So I think it's sort of that mindset shift. Let's say I'm an author who writes on stoicism, and I may be like, okay, you know what, I'm writing on it, but I don't know what to do in my podcast. It's pretty simple, right? You can have guests on your podcast and you can talk about things. So there are different formats. What maybe from an author standpoint is like, okay, I'm used to writing, but I would switch that around and say, okay, you're also a creator, so what can I do with that, right? So maybe it's a 3-minute episode that comes out once every 3 days, right? And where you're talking about I don't know, this thing from a particular book, and then once every 4 episodes you're like, okay, I'll get a friend who's a avid book reader or an author to come and guest on it, right? So it doesn't have to be, you're a creator at the end of the day. You're not only an author and a person who's writing, and that's what podcasts allow you to do, right? And at the root of that is, like you mentioned, experimentation. So I think if you're open to doing that and tweaking things and seeing how audiences respond, then the sort of feedback that you get is going to be phenomenal, right? So yeah, I think that could be one definite avenue for budding writers or even established writers.
Absolutely. Okay, so I have a last segment of the episode for you, which is a rapid fire segment where I'm just gonna, obviously, like rapid fire works, throw questions at you and hopefully you answer them super fast.
Are you sending me a hamper if I okay, let's go.
Okay, the first question is, would you ever write a book?
Yes,
What
I would love to.
Okay, what would the title of your book be?
I haven't thought of a title. I can tell you a storyline, but I'm scared someone will steal it. It's actually a fiction idea that I had for in the world of animals, right? So there's this cow that's about to be, it's sort of like in the George Orwell 1984 space. There's a cow that's about to be slaughtered, and he sort of runs from Kerala, which is where I'm from, and then he has like this whole adventure. So it's sort of like a 3-part adventure series that I have in my head that obviously I haven't gotten down to writing. Weirdly enough, not that I read fiction, but yeah, weirdly enough, that's my idea.
That is very unexpected. I did not expect your book idea to be that. So I'm very excited and happy about this. Definitely write it. Okay. A podcast you wish you had produced?
Against the Rules. Again, I'm a huge fanboy, so it's, if you haven't listened to the podcast, you should check it out, right?
A creator or producer that you would love to work with in India?
So I don't know one specific name or anything. We haven't made a podcast star yet, right? I think the last audio star was maybe Nilesh Misra, now maybe Mantra. But we haven't had someone who is from audio, from podcasting, who's then sort of risen. So I would say that person is who I'm sort of waiting to collaborate with.
To be discovered.
To be discovered, yes.
Okay. If you could only listen to one podcast your entire life, which podcast would that be?
The Space. It's an Australian podcast, mindfulness podcast, which is 2 or 3 minutes long, which gives you every day, it gives you tips on how to deal with anxiety, nervousness, all of that sort of thing. I listen to it pretty religiously, and it's 3 minutes. So I mean, I listen to podcasts for a living, on all the pitches that come in. This one is something that I really enjoy. So it's the first thing in the morning, first 1 hour in the morning, I'm listening to that. So I would listen to that.
Okay, nice. Okay, the final question is, what is your message to all the book people in India or all over the world?
Experiment with podcasts, experiment with audio. I think that's something that now is the time to do it, because it's just there are no rules, right? Like, we're figuring out the ecosystem as we go. We're making the rules. I would say experiment with it. If it doesn't work, it's fine. It's like it's like having brown bread and white bread. Now brown bread is all the rage, but when it started off, like, growing up, at least I was eating white bread, and someone said, hey, why don't you try brown bread? And I tried it, and I was like, it's not bad. I should have it, right? It's not as sweet as the white bread and stuff. But even if you can get one person to sort of experiment, and it's okay if they go back and they say, hey, this is not for me, but not trying it would be, would just be very sad, right?
That's a great message.
I hope so. And yeah, it's been great chatting with you. Especially enjoyed the rapid fire. I'll wait for my hamper at home.
I'll definitely send you a hamper. But thank you so much, Unni, for being a part of this podcast and for talking to all the writers and the book people out here in India. Great to have you.
Thanks for having me. I hope this conversation was helpful. Had a lovely time chatting.
Me too.
That marks the end of another episode of The Book People. Tune in every Thursday for some breakdowns, some truth bombs, and some insightful and real conversations with industry experts about all things books. This podcast is created by Bound. We work with writers and brands to create content across formats, whether it's books, podcasts, newsletters, or screenplays. So get in touch to see how we can help you grow through stories. And follow us at Bound India on all social media platforms. I'm your host, Aishwarya Zavalgekar. You can follow me on LinkedIn, where I share many more insights about books and content. Or you can get in touch with me at aishwarya@boundindia.com if you have any suggestions on topics I should cover, or if you want to book any of my services or consultation calls. Until then, keep writing.